My name is Patricia, and I'm 34 years old. I live alone these days. Not too long ago, I was living with my husband Carl in a typical 2-story apartment. We led a quiet life together, mostly to save cash. However, the life I had dreamed of and the reality of marriage were starkly different. I met Carl at a social event, where he let slip that he worked for a big company. Quite a few other women at the event seemed drawn to him, but we hit it off the best, mostly because we both loved outdoor activities. After the event, I ended up hanging out with him several times, and a month later, he asked me out on a date. We were both 26 then. After dating for 3 years, he popped the question. It's been 5 years since we got hitched, and now I'm back to living alone. I feel like these 5 years have been squandered. The first year of our marriage was fairly uneventful. I did sense that my in-laws weren't exactly thrilled with me as their daughter-in-law, but I didn't let it bother me much, since our interactions were minimal. However, a year into our marriage, Carl abruptly quit his job. Well, I wasn't getting along with my boss anymore, so I decided to quit. I wrote so much bad stuff about him in my resignation letter that there's no going back, he told me nonchalantly. Before we tied the knot, my in-laws had expressed their disapproval of a woman working, so I had quit my job. But with this sudden twist, we found ourselves both out of work. We couldn't sustain our lifestyle like this. Yet, he just brushed it off, saying, "I will chill out for a bit," and didn't even bother to hunt for a new job. He would just lounge around all day, claiming he'd visited the job center and even occasionally asked me for some spending cash. Previously, he worked, and I was a homemaker, so I didn't have any extra money to give him, but he didn't seem to grasp the situation and refused to job hunt. So I decided to rejoin the workforce. Luckily, my co-workers didn't offer any negative feelings about my return. They were actually pretty welcoming. The ones who were unhappy about my return to work were Carl's folks. They had expressed their disdain for working women when we married, so I wasn't surprised they objected to me working now. I asked Carl to break the news to his parents that I was working because he had quit his job, but he dismissed it. "Yeah, I'll let them know eventually," he said. But he never did. Instead, they somehow learned I was back at work. They called me immediately, demanding I quit and calling it indecent. Annoyed, I told them to ask Carl why I had to go back to work and ended the call. That turned out to be a mistake. Carl had told them that I went back to work because I wanted my own money. This only fueled their criticism of me. Naturally, I was livid with Carl and confronted him about his lie. He just shrugged it off. "Well, you know how my parents are about image, right? If I told them I'd quit, they might pass out. I want you to wait until I find another job and reassure them it's all good," he suggested. The prospect of tolerating my in-laws' snarky comments for an undetermined amount of time, just to maintain the pretense Carl and his parents cared about, gave me a splitting headache. So I shrugged off Carl's views and headed over to his folks to spill the beans about his job situation. They seemed skeptical, just taking my word for it. So I came prepared with an audio clip where Carl talks about quitting his job. Since I frequently asked him why he quit and when he planned to job hunt, gathering the recording was a piece of cake. Once they heard the evidence, they blanched. Yet, they didn't apologize. Instead, my father-in-law began laying into me without warning. "If you had backed up your husband like a good wife should, he wouldn't have quit his job out of the blue," he started. His wife chimed in with a blame game, weeping uncontrollably. Their yelling must have been loud because their daughter, Jane, who was in another room, poked her head into the living room. "What's up with everyone?" she asked. Her mother tried to usher Jane out of the room, but I was still playing the voice recording, so Jane caught on quickly. "I've heard that Jane, a 28-year-old remote worker, has a boyfriend, but begged me to keep it a secret because her folks or Carl finding out would mean trouble. It seems she longed to work outside the house, but her parents, who believe women shouldn't work, had her hands tied. Jane looks up to me, and her parents have been bad-mouthing me to her, trying to make her dislike me. But so far, no dice." Jane, hearing the recording, gave her parents a mean glare. "Are you two dissing Patricia again? You're all about keeping up appearances, but do you think it's honorable to gang up on her? And Carl quit his job. Despite this, you've been ripping into her for going back to work. She had no choice. You guys really don't think things through. If you're going to prop up Carl just because he's a guy, find him a job pronto, she railed at them. Faced with their daughter's harsh words, they slumped and hung their heads. Jane left them in that state and came over to me. Patricia, I'm really sorry about my dimwit brother. I guess he's going to start mooching off your earnings. When that time comes, don't think twice about cutting him loose, she said. I smiled back at her. That's the plan. I have no intention of spending my life with a man who refuses to work, I replied. His parents, afraid it would be scandalous to be dumped by their daughter-in-law, were more insistent than I was on Carl landing a job. They often hounded him, who was idling around without visiting the job center. Thanks to that, he landed a gig at another company 6 months after quitting. He had been with a big company earlier, so he found employment, but he sneered at the company as small fry that doesn't match my skills. I had a hunch this job wouldn't last long either. My prediction was spot on, or maybe he lasted longer than I thought. But after 3 years, he said, this place wasn't a good fit after all, and bailed. Maybe hanging in there for 3 years counted as a win. Even though he was back at work, by then I had been with one company for longer than he had. Through my dedication and commitment, I had climbed the corporate ladder to a managerial position, and my salary had increased. I knew I couldn't bank on the careless Carl anymore, and there was something else. I needed cash to investigate something that was bugging me. As a result of my investigation, I decided to take action. Hey, let's call it quits, I said, making Carl's eyes pop. I don't think I can stick it out with you any longer, so let's get a divorce. He was a man with a peculiar air of self-assuredness, having always been coddled by his parents and told that, as a man, he was destined for great things. So when I brought up the topic of divorce, even while I handed him the divorce papers, he smirked and said, Are you sure about ditching me? It's unthinkable that a woman like you would ever snag a man like me again. I couldn't quite grasp his words, but I took the divorce papers and penned my name in the designated space. Despite this, he seemed to believe he was immune to divorce, asserting, If you're that obstinate, I will head back to my parents' house for a bit. Have fun sobbing your heart out in my absence. He hastily packed his stuff and headed home. This worked out in my favor. I submitted the divorce papers while he was gone, signed a lease for a new apartment, moved in, and kicked off my solo life. However, the place I'd moved into was designed for two. I had someone I had invited to share the place with me, so it was a temporary loan of life until she moved in. 2 weeks after I began my solo life, I got a surprise call from Carl. Hey, you must have done some soul searching by now, right? Besides, I've pieced together that this whole divorce gig is just a ruse for a surprise. Let me into the apartment ASAP. My parents and the movers are all waiting downstairs. Excuse me? I replied, confused. I peeked down at the front of the apartment from the balcony on the 55th floor. People looked as tiny as ants, but I spotted a truck parked in front. It was possibly the moving truck he was in. I couldn't comprehend his words, so I replied, What are you on about? I'm lost. Then he blurted out cheerfully, From today, we are moving in, all 5 of us. Hence, the move. Don't keep my folks waiting. I was baffled as to why he still believed we were married, even after he'd signed the divorce papers. Suddenly, I heard his mother's voice on the other end of the line. It seemed his parents had tagged along. Patricia, looks like you're raking in quite the dough while sidelining your husband, aren't you? That's why he can't make much money. You're the one draining his drive. It's inevitable. If you're the breadwinner, then you have no choice but to play the supporting role to a working wife, she uttered. It appeared that I had always been belittled by them in my capacity as his wife. I sighed and let one thing out for her. By the way, I'm single. A brief pause followed. What? My mother-in-law exclaimed. I divorced Carl the other day. I told him I wanted to split, and he signed the divorce papers I handed him. So I filled in my part and finalized it. I have no plans to support a stranger, I concluded. With that, I ended the call. Behind me, Jane, who was whipping up some cocoa, asked, Was that my brother just now? Yeah, it was Carl and his mother. They seemed to have discovered that I moved into the apartment and came with the intent to freeload. They mentioned they were planning on a family of 5, so they probably counted you in as well, I responded. At my words, she grimaced. Oh, I'm sorry. It might be my fault. Maybe he spotted my phone or heard me speaking to the mover when I was relocating. Honestly, your family has no shred of decency when it comes to women, I added. Actually, I'm sharing the place with Jane. I suggested the room sharing to help her, as she was unable to leave her house due to constant interference from her family. I chose this upscale apartment because I thought that even if relocated, her family would barge in if the security was lax. No matter how long they camp out in front of the apartment, they likely won't be able to get in. Her boyfriend is currently on a solo assignment overseas, so we were discussing room sharing for a few years. Even so, I was taken aback when they abruptly switched their stance on being financially dependent, I remarked. Did my mom actually say that? Jane cocked her head in confusion. Up until now, my mother had always maintained that it was unseemly for women to work. She constantly advised me to avoid venturing out for work as well. I was perturbed when she suddenly flip-flopped on her opinion and announced she intended to live off her daughter-in-law. Come to think of it, Jane said as if the penny had dropped. Maybe my dad finally confessed to my mom that he lost his job. I exclaimed in surprise, What? Your dad is jobless. It appears he got sacked by his boss for blurting out sexist remarks like, all female employees need to do is brew coffee, undermining their work and dismissing their contribution merely because they were women, my sister-in-law explained. Oh wow, I thought he only harbored such traits at home, I sighed. Evidently he was imposing his misogynistic views on others outside home as well. Now, none of the three, Carl and his parents, are employed. As a result, they must be scheming to camp with Jane and me, who are gainfully employed. The fact that they snooped around her smartphone implies they must have discovered that I'm living with her. Regardless of what they presume, it seems like they concluded, if Jane is rooming with Patricia, we can band together too and break into their flat, we reasoned. While we were discussing this, I had no option but to pick up the phone since Carl wouldn't stop calling. Hello, stop this dumb foolery. Haven't you had a moment of introspection? I'm warning you, I'm coming back. My husband kept insisting. Why would I let a stranger into my home? We were divorced, so could you stop meddling? I responded, growing weary of the conversation. Then why are you living with Jane? He demanded. She's my sister. She expressed her wish to disassociate from you guys. She said she left a note at your house, I added. That note is void. You remain my wife until I say I've had enough of you, and Jane is my sister. Got it. Carl wouldn't stop. Oh, this is such a hassle. Could you liaise with my attorney from now on? I plan to sue you for damages due to your infidelity in the future, I continued angrily. A lawyer? Infidelity? What on earth are you babbling about? He asked, confused. I sighed. He never questioned why I wanted a divorce, but I chose to separate ties with him after uncovering his infidelity. He was fired from a blue-chip firm and from the subsequent company he landed a job with, because he was making advances on a female newcomer at the firm. Both dismissals resulted from infidelity occurring during office hours, and he appeared to have promptly split up with the woman he was seeing as soon as he was fired. The reason I was kept in the dark until now was because the companies didn't want to disclose this, fearing the story would leak. When he resigned for reasons I didn't approve of, I hired a private detective to dig up the truth and found it was due to infidelity. Carl was rattled when his infidelity was exposed, but swiftly resorted to blaming the victim, professing things like, "It's the fault of the one who gets cheated on. Infidelity is a mark of a man's honor." So I calmly retorted, "There's no honor in a man who's broke," and ended the call. In the end, they moved back to their old house after apologizing to the movers. However, they seemed to have resolved to sell the old house as well, and they hastily began scouting for an affordable apartment for the trio to live in. There was also a claim for damages from me, and they had to live together, so Carl and his dad had no option but to start job hunting. But his mother had never worked before, and she had been disparaging me, so she didn't find work readily. On the contrary, she's lazing around at home, claiming women don't need to work. As a consequence, Carl and his father are seething. Although they used to be in perfect harmony, they are now living together, hurling insults at each other. When we heard such tales through Jane's friend, we agreed on how fortunate we were to escape that family. This room sharing will end once Jane's boyfriend returns from abroad, but that's when she plans to tie the knot. She turned to me. I want you to grace my wedding as my family, and I nearly teared up. I intend to continue championing her happiness while pursuing my own.